Fahad Ali is a molecular biologist and a very busy academic by trade, but is also a diasporic Palestinian and an activist. Of course, he's been thrust into this urgent worldwide struggle in aid of Palestine since October the 7th. And since then, he's helped organise many of the huge Sydney rallies that we've seen, obviously calling for a ceasefire urgently, but more broadly, Palestinian liberation. So I couldn't think of anyone better, frankly, to talk to me right now for, I suppose, the current state of play for goals and priorities for activism for Palestinians, but in Australia as we are. So on that note, Fahad, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me, mate.
Thank you for having me on.
I do appreciate your time so much, not only because I know how busy you are at the moment, but, I appreciate it's obviously a much more distressing and personal context for yourself as a Palestinian, obviously, and so I really appreciate it. I know how difficult it must be to do public spots and that kind of thing, but I admire your activism all the more for that. To open, you recently said on Twitter that you don't believe that donating or fundraising campaigns or efforts are of a priority anymore, not so much as organising or mobilising. Can you tell me what led you to that conclusion and, speak a bit about organising and mobilisation right now?
Well, I think the important thing to recognise is that at the very, very beginning of the current exchange of hostilities, you had a situation where we know from experience that every time Israel launches a war on Gaza, the outcome is gruesome. This is a place in the world that is immensely densely populated. There is a crisis in terms of infrastructure, which has been ongoing for the past 2 decades. It's not as though Gaza was a happy place before the 7th of October. We knew the UN was telling us that it was on its way to becoming uninhabitable, and you've got 2.3 million people living there. So humanitarian aid is always needed, and there are some very important aid agencies working on the ground already. We've got, the United Nations, you've got World Vision, you've got the AFIDA, the branch of the aid agency of the Australian Union movement. So all of these organizations doing very, very important work. But what we saw now is that none of the humanitarian aid is actually getting in. So there's no water, there's no food, there's no fuel, no electricity. The UN is saying that there aren't even enough body bags. So you're faced with that scenario where aid just isn't going to get in. And so right now you can donate as much as you like to your favorite charity, Doctors Without Borders or World Vision or, Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. You can do that, but that money is not going to be used in the immediate term because there is simply no way for aid to be imported. And so what we're saying is, right now, the priority is to call for a ceasefire, to call for an end to the violence, and for the establishment of humanitarian corridors, access to aid that would make those donations, useful in the first place. But in the immediate period, we're asking people mobilize, organize, and if you want to put your money to something, put your money towards organizations that are organizing and doing the work. So the Australia Palestine Advocacy Network is a great one. The Palestine Action Group, there are many of those groups. We're saying donate to us, let us mobilize, let us get the change that we need to get for a ceasefire.
Here in Australia, I suppose when we go to rallies or take actions, which don't necessarily just have to be rallies, but I suppose we can get onto the breadth of actions later. When we go to them, we, of course, listen to speakers who talk about ceasefire. We're gathering together to demand that, but we are also very specifically in the context of Australia trying to demand that the people in power here, our government, ask that of Israel, because obviously they have the sway here. If it's the people in power and in the West internationally who give tacit or, who are ultimately complicit in this through providing aid or even just not using the word ceasefire, that is what we're trying to pressure our government to change their tune on. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. it's remarkable how much popular support there is for an end to the violence. If you ask most people, they'd say, "Oh, the war is not good. The war needs to end. It's gone a bit too far." Palestinians obviously have known the nature of the aggression that we've suffered for 75 years, but to the average person on the street, ask them what they think, and they're like, "Oh, maybe Israel has like crossed a line." Um, so people broadly want it to stop. Politicians don't seem to recognize just how unpopular this continual sort of deference to Israel is. But I think Australia is in a unique position where, as you know, for whatever lefty cred that Albo and Penny Wong still have, their priorities are very much to not rock the boat when it comes to the US lines. And so that's where it becomes difficult. And I think this is really important for everyone on the broad progressive sort of side of politics to understand, is that if you worry about things like, AUKUS, if you worry about our defense treaties with the US, if you worry about, if for even people for whom think that what's happening to Julian Assange is a massive shame, all of that stuff is tied up around Palestine because they're part of the same parcel of Australian sort of movement in line with the US. And so that needs to end. And we need to assert our national interests, which are not necessarily the US or Israel's national interests. And that's something that I think all people should be paying attention to. So yeah, I don't know how that plays out in the longer term, but it's a question of democracy and people power over, the vested interests of, people in government.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about our level of complicity on a defence level. There was that expose just done the other day, published just the other day. I'll definitely include it in the description when I publish this video. But talking about how Pine Gap, in fact, is supplying a lot of the intelligence data that is being used to determine where Israeli warplanes go and bomb, whether it be, the water tanks of a refugee camp or a hospital or ambulances. Apparently, we are hosting we host the secret defense site that supplies that intelligence data, which ups our level of complicity manifold. It becomes not just by far away from just being a matter of Penny Wong or Albanese being too afraid to say ceasefire and just talking about humanitarian pauses. Instead, we're actually militarily complicit. I saw you retweet at least once, or you'd written about how people in Gaza or the West Bank, they see this stuff and it motivates them. Can you speak to that at all?
I think that there's a feeling many people have that coming to protests doesn't do anything because people in power are never going to really care. And unfortunately, the game is rigged against, the game is rigged against us. But I think for people in Palestine, they can see the outpouring of support from the world, and that's a very strong light in amidst all this darkness. Now, I think it's important to also recognize that Palestinians will liberate ourselves, right? So people on the ground in Palestine have been resisting, have been living and continuing to live and continuing to remain steadfast for 75 years. And if you just look at some of the links of solidarity that were built, for example, between people in the West Bank and people in Ferguson during the protests in the US, people in Palestine saying, well, this is how you deal with tear gas. This is how you deal with over-militarized policing. And that kind of exchange of information was really quite important to see. And so I think we need to remember that people in Palestine are not sort of these, agents without any kind of autonomy or any kind of power. People in Palestine actually can actively resist. And we also need to accept that is going to be the state of affairs. But at the same time, as people are struggling to stay alive, as they're facing settler violence, as they're facing expulsion from their homes and the destruction of their property, seeing the world say, no, this cannot be sustained is a powerful message, because it makes you, and I think for many people, it gives us a belief that, yes, there is going to be conclusion to this, where there is a just outcome, and the people of Palestine are not alone in that struggle. And I think this is also very important, the struggle for Palestine is not just about Palestine. It has links to so many other kinds of or so many other arenas of justice in the world. So right now we're looking at, what's going on in the Congo, what's going on in Sudan. These are also big, important world events that we should be paying attention to. Thinking about over policing in the US and Australia, these are also linked to Palestine. Israel exports the violence that it tests upon Palestinians to the rest of the world, security, surveillance technologies. So by putting pressure on our government, by going to protest, by sending a message to the people of Palestine that we stand with you, we actually reflect that back onto ourselves, because it creates a future hope for a world where none of this violence exists.
Let's talk then on that note about kinds of action. What are we seeing? We're seeing rallies so far. I've seen sit-ins, there's been people getting dragged away from outside Labor politicians' offices. Mass calls to the offices of those politicians to apply pressure, which I know works. I think I saw Janet Rice talking about how, her phone lines don't get a breather for a moment. So she said, I can only imagine how it is for Penny Wong's office, which is great. People are planning to shut down ports where trade with Israel is being done, which is fantastic. What do you want to see people doing? And if it's time for organising and mobilisation, what do you? we've got lots of capable activists out there, but what do you want to see people doing?
We need to keep going to the rallies. We need to keep taking the streets. We need to keep talking about this. Something that I think is remarkable is that there are still people who don't have any notion of what's going on in Palestine. And I think that this is almost deliberate. It is very, very hard to get an understanding of the situation in Palestine if you watch the news, because journalists are very sensitive to the issue. They don't want to. They try to present a picture of balance, which isn't really balance. What they're really trying to do is avoid getting yelled at. So in doing so, they don't actually report on anything with any great depth. And then you have journalists who I think are a bit worse than that, who are actively complicit, who will drone on about Hamas and Israel's right to self-defense. And we're well past that conversation now. I think to ask a Palestinian interviewee, do you condemn Hamas? I think it's remarkable. It's like saying you are a terror sympathizer unless otherwise proven. This stuff needs to end. This kind of behavior of the press needs to end. And so if you're a layperson and just watching the news, you have no point of reference what's going on. And so there's just a big question mark over the whole situation for you. But at the same time, Palestinians continue to put out resources, continue to share our stories, to tell you about, our family members who have been killed, what it's like to be in the West Bank, what it's like to be in Gaza. And, we're asking people to boost those voices, not only directly by, amplifying Palestinians, sharing and liking, content from Palestinians, but also to come to the protests, to have conversations with their friends and family members and colleagues and loved ones and, everyone you can, to have a chat to your neighbor. Because one of the things that is going to be really important is, and I draw the comparison here with apartheid era South Africa, which was that you had Western complicity almost the whole way along, and then just at the very end, everybody was like, oh, I guess we can decide apartheid is bad now. But that was built upon mounting pressure and growing public disease with what was happening in South Africa. So I think we just need to have those conversations and keep coming to actions.
Okay. Yep. I actually, can I say I recognise in hindsight I had, for someone who, this is a bit hypocritical for someone who produces and releases activist content online, but I did have something of an element, and I think a lot of us on the left did, an element of fatigue and a feeling of defeat when it came to producing and putting out there your sentiment online. It's very easy to feel inundated in a sea of contrary propaganda content when you're tackling the far right on any front, and because indeed you often are. But I've also seen a lot of writing through this past month on how everybody needs to be telling the truth about this matter and telling it and sharing and, as you say, amplifying Palestinian voices. And if we all do that, we'll reach more people. So I just wanted to, I suppose, reify that, because it's kind of a segue to talking about building consensus, and solidarity. You said before, there's a lot of people you go onto the street and you ask them and they say, that they share this sentiment that at the very least, that the Israeli government has gone too far. I wanted to ask you on that note, how big of a broad church do we need this movement to be right now? I can go online and I can see fucking Candace Owens for once sharing her sentiment. But I know you've had to consider stuff like this because you've had to make a very firm statement, as you admirably did so quickly and firmly, about, say, actual anti-Semites, would be thinking they're allies. There they are at the rally. In fact, they're hijacking the entire movement, what they were doing. And that was a rally in Sydney earlier in October. My question is, do we need the biggest, broadest church ever? And where do we say no? Where are you at with this?
Yeah, look, no. It's tempting to think that you build power by just collecting as many kind of groups as possible. But I don't think that actually works. I think that for myself, I'm a progressive activist. My vision of the future is a progressive one. I would find it very difficult for me to see any kind of situation in which I would stand side by side with someone who was, like Candace Owens, for instance. There are, and I have to say this, there have been people, including in our government, who are pro-Palestine, but are from the more conservative side of things. So you've got maybe a national or two. You've got some small number of liberals who are pro-Palestine, but it's not really where that politics fits in very well. And then you have on Twitter, you see these sort of like MAGA Republicans being pro-Palestine. And I think that we need to really pay attention to the intention of this. So for us, Palestinians, our intention is to, liberate our people and our land and to build a future free from violence and injustice. For people who are perhaps on the far right who are now talking about Palestine, I think, A, it's a grift, but B, I think that their intentions with regards to this are not sincere. I think there probably is some attempt to play on, some feelings of prejudice. If you're an anti-Semite, for example, saying pro-free Palestine, like, I don't want you around. I don't want you in the movement, and I actually, I don't trust you to be anywhere near us. So we don't need the biggest, broadest church, but what we do need is, we can build our allies where we find them. I think that where we draw the line, that needs to be, we need to make it clear that no racism, no racism, no any kind of prejudice, no Islamophobia, no sexism, no misogyny, no queerphobia. These are all the things that are core values for me. And if we set that as a standard and we say, this is what our movement is about, if you can't sign up to these values, then sorry, but take care. We don't want you around. Like that. That's what it's about for me, I think.
Some forms of solidarity, and this is on the other hand, some forms of solidarity are pivotally important. Like crucially right now, I can see how vitally important Jewish-Muslim solidarity is at the moment, to silencing, I suppose, all the PR spin going around at the moment. Do you envision this movement being led by a combination of Palestinians and Jewish anti-Zionists? Is that pivotally important here, or is this kind of a solidarity that everyone should be leading?
Well, I think Palestinians need to be central. I think Palestinians need to be the key organizers of this. Now, in terms of the anti-Zionist solidarity that we have built with people in the Jewish community, yes, it's. I suppose it's tempting to say, oh, we need to, because there's so many accusations, cynical and false accusations of anti-Semitism being thrown at Palestinians. If I go out and say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, there will be people who call me an anti-Semite for saying so, which I think we all recognize as like absurd. But I don't build those solidarity links with people in the Jewish community because I'm looking for some kind of insurance. I'm building those links because it's the right thing to do. Because and I've said this as well. One thing that is really dangerous is the weaponization of Islamophobia is actually doing nothing apart from empowering the far right. And a very good friend of mine said to me, and he's Jewish, he said to me, they hate you in the immediate and they hate us in the ultimate. So let's say that the far right is successful, all the Muslims are deported. The far right's not going to be like, yay, we've won, time to go home. They're then going to attack Jews. So this disgusting racism that we're now seeing enabled is not contributing to Jewish safety. In many ways, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab prejudice are the same thing with different faces. So we stand in solidarity not because it's convenient, but because it's essential. We need to learn to protect each other. And one of the elements of Zionism that I find unappealing, right? If I understand it correctly, it is saying we can never be safe unless we are, in our kind of ethno state that has this enormous military. But my vision of the world is one where we protect each other, where we build a kind of future where we rely on each other and we don't need to be, siloed into these tribalist ethno states. I think that's much healthier for individuals and the world than saying, nah, we're just going to build some nukes and silo ourselves. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. We need to build solidarity and we need to be genuine and recognize that, we have a shared humanity and that is what we should be pursuing.
These are such good thoughts. I've appreciated this chat so much. Tell me then, where should people go to find out more information about stuff to do, actions they can take?
Yep. So one thing that I would recommend everybody does is sign up to the Australia Palestine Advocacy Network. That's apan.org.au. There's also a website that we've built recently, which is standwithpalestine.au, and there's a couple of resources on there that are updated regularly. It's a place to go if you need any help, if you want to volunteer, if you want to know what upcoming actions there are. And we're always looking for people to contribute. So if you want to get involved, please jump on, have a chat to APAN, jump onto the Stand with Palestine website. And we'd love to see you. And obviously not everybody can attend physical protests for multiple reasons, but there's always something to be done. And we'd love to see you in any kind of way that you're able to, engage.
Comrade, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thanks for your time. And I'll see you at one of these rallies, hey?
My pleasure. See you soon.
There are links to both of the websites that Fahad suggested, APAN and Stand With Palestine, in the description of this video. Please visit them and find out about all the things that you can do to support a ceasefire and pressure this government and help demand liberation for Palestinians. Power in Australia, or for that matter abroad, will not change its mind because it hasn't done so for decades already. It needs to be pressured by a mass movement from below and direct action, and now's the time for that to occur. It's very urgent This is one of those movements that you will one day look back on fondly and be happy that you took part in. So do it now.